What happens when Hollywood's most respected actress sits down for what should be a routine interview, only to face a host who thinks he can say anything he wants? In just 42 seconds, one comment would destroy years of television credibility and expose the ugly truth about power, respect, and what happens when entitlement meets its match. The studio lights were blazing hot that Tuesday evening as Meryl Streep walked onto the set of Piers Morgan's primetime talk show. She had agreed to this interview to promote her latest film, a quiet drama about resilience and dignity. Little did she know she was about to demonstrate both qualities in ways she never expected. Piers Morgan sat behind his desk, that familiar smirk already playing across his face. He had built his career on controversy, on pushing buttons, on making guests squirm. Tonight, he thought he had landed the perfect target. After all, what could the Queen of Hollywood possibly do to him? The interview started innocently enough. Piers began with the usual pleasantries, asking about her new movie, her preparation for the role, her thoughts on the current state of cinema. Meryl answered with her characteristic grace and intelligence, speaking thoughtfully about her craft and the story she chose to tell. But something was off. There was an edge in Piers's voice, a barely concealed contempt that seemed to grow with each passing minute. His questions became sharper, more personal, designed not to illuminate but to provoke. "So Meryl," Piers said, leaning back in his chair with that self-satisfied grin, "you've been in this business for what, 40 years now? That's quite a run. Tell me, at your age, do you ever worry that audiences might be getting tired of seeing the same face on screen?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Meryl blinked once, twice, processing not just the words but the venom behind them. The studio audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even the camera operators seemed to sense that something had changed in the room. "Well, Piers," Meryl replied carefully, her voice steady but her eyes showing the first flash of steel, "I think audiences appreciate authenticity. They can tell when someone is genuine and when someone is simply performing for attention." The subtle dig wasn't lost on anyone, especially Piers. His smile faltered for just a moment before returning, wider and more forced than before. "Oh, authenticity," he laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's rich coming from someone who makes a living pretending to be other people. But let's talk about real authenticity. Your political opinions, for instance. Don't you think actors should stick to acting instead of lecturing the rest of us about how to think?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Meryl's posture straightened, and for those who knew her well, the warning signs were all there. But Piers Morgan was too intoxicated by his own perceived power to notice. "I believe," Meryl said slowly, choosing each word with surgical precision, "that every citizen has not just the right, but the responsibility to speak up about issues that matter to them. That's what democracy means." "Democracy?" Piers scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "Easy to talk about democracy when you live in your Hollywood bubble, surrounded by people who agree with everything you say. What do you really know about the struggles of ordinary people?" The audience was completely silent now. You could have heard a pin drop in that studio. Meryl's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, but her voice remained controlled. "I know that ordinary people deserve respect," she said quietly. "I know they deserve to be heard, not talked down to by people who think their platform gives them the right to be cruel." Piers's eyes glittered with malicious delight. He thought he had her on the ropes, thought he was winning some sort of battle. He had no idea he was about to step on a landmine of his own making. "Cruel?" he repeated, his voice rising with mock indignation. "I'm just asking the tough questions that other interviewers are too afraid to ask. Isn't that what journalism is supposed to be about?" "There's a difference between tough questions and cheap shots," Meryl replied, her composure still intact but clearly hanging by a thread. "A real journalist seeks truth. What you're doing is something else entirely." The insult hit its mark. Piers's face flushed red, and his carefully maintained facade of professional detachment cracked like an eggshell. "Something else entirely?" he sputtered. "I've been doing this longer than you've been winning your little gold statues. I've interviewed presidents, prime ministers, people who actually matter in the real world." The words were out before he could stop them, and the moment they hit the air, everyone in that studio knew he had gone too far. Meryl's eyes widened, not with hurt, but with the kind of cold fury that comes when someone shows you exactly who they really are. "People who actually matter?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying to every corner of the studio. "Is that what you think? That artists don't matter? That the people who create the stories that help us understand ourselves and each other don't matter?" Piers realized his mistake, But instead of backing down, he doubled down, with the desperation of a man who knows he's losing control. "Oh, come on, don't be so dramatic," he said, trying to laugh it off. "You know what I meant." But Meryl wasn't about to let him off the hook. Not this time. Not when he had revealed the ugly truth about how he saw her, how he saw all artists, all creative people who dared to have opinions beyond their craft. "No, I don't know what you meant," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Why don't you explain it to me? Explain to everyone watching how you decide which human beings matter and which ones don't." The silence that followed was deafening. Piers Morgan sat there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, realizing he had painted himself into a corner with no graceful way out. The studio audience was frozen, watching this train wreck unfold in real time. That's not what he stammered. But Meryl wasn't finished with him. Not even close. "Because from where I'm sitting," she continued, her voice calm but carrying the weight of decades of experience dealing with men who thought they could diminish her, "it sounds like you believe that only people in certain professions deserve to have their voices heard. That only certain types of work have value." Piers tried to regain his footing, puffing up his chest and adopting that condescending tone he used when he felt cornered. "Look, Meryl, you're twisting my words. All I'm saying is that there's a difference between entertainment and real-world importance. When people are struggling to pay their bills, to keep their jobs, they don't really care what some actress thinks about politics." The contempt in his voice when he said "some actress" was unmistakable. It wasn't just dismissive. It was deliberately designed to reduce one of the most accomplished performers of her generation to nothing more than a pretty face reading line. But if Piers thought this would intimidate Meryl Streep, he had seriously miscalculated. Her eyes flashed with the kind of fire that had powered every great performance of her career. "Some actress?" she repeated, and there was something almost dangerous in her voice now. "Is that really how you see me? How you see all of us who choose to dedicate our lives to telling stories that help people understand their own humanity?" "Oh, please," Piers scoffed, rolling his eyes theatrically. "Don't make this about art and humanity. You're in the entertainment business. You play dress up and pretend to be other people for money. Let's not pretend it's some noble calling." The words hit the studio like a physical slap. Several audience members audibly gasped. Even the crew members, who had seen their share of uncomfortable interviews, looked stunned by the sheer nastiness of the attack. But Meryl didn't flinch. Instead, something remarkable happened. She smiled. Not a friendly smile, not a polite smile, but the kind of smile that appears on someone's face when they realize their opponent has just handed them the perfect weapon. "Play dress up and pretend," she said slowly, savoring each word. "Is that what you think acting is? Is that what you think I've been doing for the past 4 decades? Well, when you strip away all the pretentious talk about craft and method and all that nonsense, yes," Piers said, clearly thinking he was delivering a knockout blow. "At the end of the day, you're a very expensive game of make-believe." The audience was shifting restlessly now. Some were looking genuinely angry at Piers's treatment of their guest. Others seemed fascinated by the sheer audacity of what they were witnessing. But all of them could sense that something significant was about to happen. Meryl leaned forward in her chair, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades perfecting her craft, earning the respect of her peers, and proving again and again that she belonged at the very top of her profession. "You want to know what acting really is, Piers? It's empathy. It's the ability to step into someone else's shoes, to understand their pain, their joy, their fears, their hopes. It's about finding the universal human truths in specific situations. It's about helping people feel less alone in the world." Piers waved his hand dismissively, but there was something desperate about the gesture now, as if he could sense the ground shifting beneath his feet. "That's just Hollywood marketing speak," he said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Fancy words to make what you do sound more important than it is." "More important than it is?" Meryl's voice rose for the first time, and everyone in the studio could hear the decades of frustration, with attitudes like his finally breaking through her professional composure. "Do you have any idea how many letters I get from people telling me that a character I played helped them through a difficult time? How many people have told me that seeing their struggles reflected on screen made them feel understood?" "Oh, come on," Piers interrupted. But Meryl wasn't about to let him derail her. "Do you know what it means to a young girl to see strong female characters on screen? Do you understand what it means to someone dealing with loss to see that grief portrayed honestly and compassionately? Do you have any concept of the responsibility that comes with having a platform to tell stories that matter?" Piers's face was getting redder by the minute. He clearly hadn't expected this level of pushback, hadn't anticipated that his attempt to diminish and humiliate his guest would backfire so spectacularly. "Responsibility?" he laughed, but it sounded forced and bitter. The only responsibility you have is to entertain people. Everything else is just ego. That was the moment. The exact moment when Piers Morgan crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Because what he had just done wasn't simply disagree with Meryl's perspective on her craft. He had dismissed the very idea that art, that storytelling, that the work she had devoted her entire life to, had any value beyond shallow entertainment. Meryl stood up slowly from her chair. The movement was fluid, graceful, but there was something final about it that made everyone in the studio hold their breath. "Ego?" she said, and her voice was perfectly controlled again, which somehow made it even more powerful. "You want to talk about ego? Let's talk about the ego it takes for a talk show host to invite someone onto his program and then spend the entire time trying to tear them down. Let's talk about the ego it takes to dismiss an entire art form because you can't understand its value." Piers was sputtering now, clearly realizing that he had lost control of the situation entirely. "Now wait just a minute," he said, his voice climbing toward panic. "You can't just—" But Meryl wasn't finished. She had found her rhythm now, and 40 years of experience dealing with directors, producers, and other powerful men who thought they could intimidate her had prepared her for this exact moment. "Let's talk about the ego it takes to believe that your opinion about things you clearly don't understand matters more than the experiences of the people who actually do the work." The studio was electric with tension. Meryl Streep stood there like a force of nature, her composure intact but her words cutting through the air like surgical instruments. Piers Morgan looked like a man who had just realized he had brought a water gun to a nuclear war. "You know what, Piers?" Meryl continued, her voice gaining momentum. "I came here tonight as a courtesy. I came here to talk about a film that means something to me, that might mean something to the people watching. But instead, you've decided to use this time to showcase your own insecurities." "My insecurities?" Piers sputtered, trying desperately to regain some semblance of control. "I'm not the one getting all worked up over a simple conversation." "Simple conversation?" Meryl's eyebrows rose, and there was something almost pitying in her expression now. "Is that what you call this? Deliberately insulting your guest, dismissing their life's work, trying to make them feel small so you can feel big? That's your idea of conversation?" The audience was completely captivated now. This wasn't just a celebrity interview gone wrong. This was a masterclass in dignity under fire, a demonstration of how to respond to bullying with intelligence and grace. Piers made one last desperate attempt to turn the tables, adopting the wounded tone of someone who thought he was being unfairly attacked. "Look, I'm just doing my job here. I ask tough questions. That's what people expect from me. If you can't handle that, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews." The condescension in his voice was breathtaking. Even after everything that had just happened, he was still trying to make this Meryl's fault, still trying to position himself as the reasonable one being attacked by an unreasonable guest. But Meryl had heard that tone before. She had heard it from countless men over the years who thought they could gaslight her into doubting herself, into apologizing for taking up space, into backing down when she should stand firm. "Tough questions?" she said, and now there was genuine amusement in her voice. "Piers, you haven't asked me a single tough question tonight. Tough questions require intelligence, preparation, genuine curiosity about your subject. What you've done is throw around insults and hope something sticks." "I have not thrown around insults," Piers protested, but his voice cracked slightly on the words. "Really?" Meryl tilted her head slightly, and somehow that simple gesture made Piers look even smaller. "So, when you questioned whether audiences are tired of seeing my face, that was a tough question? When you dismissed my right to have political opinions, that was journalism? When you called my profession make-believe and suggested that artists don't matter in the real world, that was professional interviewing?" Each point landed like a physical blow. Piers' face cycled through several different shades of red as he realized that every single attack he had made was being laid out for the audience to see clearly. You're taking everything out of context," he stammered. But even he didn't sound convinced by his own words. "Context?" Meryl's voice was deadly quiet now. "The context is that you invited me here, supposedly to discuss my work, and instead decided to spend the time trying to humiliate me. The context is that you think being rude is the same thing as being provocative. The context is that you've confused cruelty with cleverness." The silence that followed was profound. You could hear the hum of the studio lights, the quiet breathing of the audience, the subtle shifting of camera operators trying to capture every moment of this extraordinary confrontation. Piers made one final, desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Now look, Meryl, I think you're overreacting here. This is just television. This is just entertainment. People understand that." And that was it. That was the moment when Piers Morgan sealed his own fate with the most tone-deaf response imaginable, because what he had just done was dismiss the entire confrontation, everything that had just happened, as meaningless television drama. Meryl looked at him for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of every woman who had ever been told she was overreacting for standing up to disrespectful treatment. "Just entertainment," she said slowly. "Just television. Just like my work is. Just make-believe, right? Just like artists don't really matter. Just like women who refuse to sit quietly while being insulted are just overreacting." She reached down and removed her microphone with a kind of deliberate precision that made it clear this wasn't a moment of anger, but a conscious decision made by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "You know what, Piers? You're absolutely right about one thing. This is just television, and I don't have to be part of it." The studio erupted. Not in applause, not in boos, but in a kind of shocked gasp that comes when people witness something they never expected to see. Meryl Streep, one of the most professional actors in Hollywood, was walking off a live television set. Piers finally seemed to grasp the magnitude of what was happening. "Meryl, wait!" he called after her, his voice cracking with panic. "Come on, don't be like this. We can talk about this." But Meryl didn't even slow down. She handed her microphone to a stunned production assistant and walked toward the exit with her head held high. "This interview is over," she said, not to Piers but to the camera, to the millions of people watching at home. "I came here to talk about art, about storytelling, about work that I believe matters. Instead, I was subjected to a display of everything that's wrong with this kind of television." She paused at the edge of the set and turned back one final time. "To anyone watching who creates something, who tells stories, who believes that art has value, remember this. You don't have to accept being diminished by people who don't understand what you do. You don't have to smile politely while someone tries to make you feel small. You always have the right to walk away." And with that, Meryl Streep walked out of the studio, leaving behind a host whose career would never recover from the 42 seconds when he revealed exactly who he really was, and an audience who had just witnessed what happens when grace meets arrogance and wins decisively. The cameras kept rolling, capturing Piers Morgan sitting alone at his desk, his carefully constructed persona in ruins, trying desperately to figure out how to fill the remaining 20 minutes of his show. But the damage was done. In trying to diminish a legend, he had only succeeded in diminishing himself.